to continue to give us to give you an update on the corn and soybean research station the past growing season, we're going to have Mike Ostlie. Mike grew up in a family farm near Northwood, North Dakota. He got his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degree from North Dakota State University. Got his PhD degree from Colorado State University. Mike is one of the newer employees of the Research Center. Mike's only been here since January of 2012, so he's still fairly new to the station, but already has made quite the impact with his work as a research agronomist. So with that, we'll turn it over to Mike.
So this morning, we're kind of trying to cover the gamut as far as corn production topics go. And my focus for the next few minutes is going to be some of these extra inputs that oftentimes are considered optional compared to more traditional pest management, fertility programs in corn. So specifically, the things I'm going to be covering are going to spend a little bit of time talking about plant health, fungicide use. We're going to talk a little bit about seed treatments, specifically with insecticide versus insecticide plus nematicide. A little bit about foliar micronutrients as well as in-furrow applications of MAP and MESZ. So actually just yesterday I received an email that includes a summary of all the corn fungicide work, not all the corn fungicide work, but a number of corn fungicide trials conducted throughout the United States in 2013. And so when we look at this data, we have 3 different application timings that were taken into account throughout the survey, averaged across states. And first thing that jumps out is there's a lot of variability in the data. Even as we've looked at this method, applying the fungicides for plant health, not in response to disease pressure. It's been fairly commonly researched now for at least 5, even up to 10 years at this point, but we still see these data sets, especially when you look across locations that are highly inconsistent. And I don't know what happened here, but sometimes these locations are reporting very negative results. But by and large, there's usually some benefit to applying fungicides to the corn. Whether or not it makes sense for a given operation, that's up to debate. But this year we finally got our data included in this information. And in this case, all the data came from the Carrington Research Center here. And what we saw was largely, you had to average all the data. We're pretty much right in the middle of the average B for this data set, in that we saw very marginal responses, if any, to applying early season fungicides. When you apply a late season fungicide, we tended to see a little bit more consistent. But then when you apply both a split application, for the most part the results just weren't there either. They go above and beyond what either application alone would have done. So this is across 13 different states. And it is also important to note that these some of these states do not provide more than a single application time. So if we look at this same survey, it's been conducted now since 2010. This is the average of what those 3 application timings have found. And each year, except for 2011, it's gotten a little bit bigger and bigger. And so in theory, the data is a little bit more reliable every year. The early application, 1 year, or if you count something, it was okay too, but mostly in the 1 year, it showed what would be what I consider a reasonable benefit to applying the herbicide. Anything less than this, and you're essentially looking at no difference compared to not doing anything. If we go to just a single application late in the season, we see actually a fairly consistent benefit, except for 2011, of somewhere between 4 and 5 bushels an acre. Again, averaged across 13 states with all the different fungicide products available. And then we go again to the split application, and only one of those years did we see a benefit greater than this one alone. Essentially, if we're looking at split applications of fungicide, it's a lot of cost, and in my opinion, it's a pretty big gamble. In this case, we only had 1 out of 4 years with a favorable yield response to the split application. And so, one of the more important things that kind of comes with this data set is looking at, did that fungicide application pay, or would it pay to consider applying a fungicide in the near future? And what we have up here is the application cost versus the price of corn. The internal data right here is all indicating how much yield benefit you're looking at. So if we have $6 corn and a $24 application cost, you need at least 4 bushel per acre bump from the fungicides or what we paid for itself. And so if we're looking at $7 corn, it's a much different story than if we're looking at $4 corn, in which case you need to see much higher benefit to applying corn fungicides versus the higher priced corn naturally. Here at Carrington, we did do a very extensive corn fungicide study this year. Well, it wasn't only in Carrington. This trial was conducted at 3 locations: Carrington, Minot, Prosper. 3 very different environments this year. As has been mentioned, Carrington was extremely dry throughout the majority of the growing season, except for planting harvest, of course. Minot was pretty well wet all year round. Prosper had a similar environment to Carrington, although they didn't get quite as dry as we did. And basically, the way to read this data, we have a number of different applications here at the V6 application, or growth stage, a number of applications at the VT growth stage. Then we had a few in-furrow applications of some of the different products out there. The numbers you see here represents the relative performance compared to the non-treated control. And so the non-treated all get a value of 1. Any number greater than 1 was a positive response to the fungicide application. Any number less than 1 was a negative response, or in most cases it's equivalent. Numbers that are highlighted in this data set were numbers that were statistically greater than the non-treated control. And essentially, both Minot and Prosper had only, with this large data set, had only 1 true difference in yield. And they weren't even the same treatment. So what we have is application of Quadris at the V6 stage, increasing yield by about 15% in Minot. And in Prosper, it was headline by almost 16%. And so this is actually fairly typical to what we've seen here at the Carrington Research Center, in that in almost all the trials we conduct with a corn fungicide, there's 1 product or maybe 2 that really stand out and provide a really large difference, because 15% difference is nothing to, it's just not too shabby. And but the problem is we didn't see that difference at any other locations. And we're essentially seeing 0 response at the locations other than the one that created that response. And so we're seeing some very inconsistent results. Now, the interesting thing here, we look at the VT growth stage, and we saw all sorts of things happening in Carrington. Sometimes some extremely large increases in yield, which really goes and backs up the data that we saw in the multi-state survey, and that the VT applications are a little more consistent, but still not there all the time. Now, the other interesting thing with this data was when we look at the in-furrow results. We had 4 in-furrow treatments of the fungicide and 4 positive yield responses from the in-furrow application as well. And again, as has been mentioned, what we have this spring, we had very wet planting conditions, followed by a very dry summer. I remember after planting this year, going out to the plots 3 weeks after planting and thinking, oh boy, nothing's up yet. Really just hoping that we're going to get something to come up due to the cold conditions we had. And it is that reason that I believe we saw such a positive response from the corn fungicide applications early on in the growing season. Probably provided some actual pathogen protection at that point to the seedlings, as well as possibly increasing the level of drought stress resistance, although none of that was measured, so that was simply speculation. And for those that are also interested, here's a graph showing the long-term averages for what our corn fungicide work has shown, both in Carrington and at Prosper. And most years, if you average across all treatments, wind up with, unless it's headline alone, you wind up with very little to no yield response, except for select few environments. For instance, 2011 in Carrington, 2012 in Carrington, we saw a little bit of a yield response. 2008, Prosper is, I think this is the only one they considered a positive yield response. Most of the time, the benefit is almost too small to measure from a statistical standpoint. Okay, moving on to the other inputs that I promised. We have a study here in Carrington that we call the Corn Intensive Management Project. It's conducted both here and Prosper again. And this is really a very complex trial. We have a set of treatments that we look at. But the thing is, each of these treatments is measured in combination with all of the other ones. We have 4 total site years of data. So we had 2 locations in 2012, 2 locations in 2013. In 2012, we looked at 2 different relative maturities. In 2013, we looked at 2 different populations. And the way that this study works, as I mentioned, everything is looked at in combination with everything else. So we had either 2 populations that had both a late season fungicide and none, and all 4 of those had each in its Poncho versus Votivo, and each one of those had each of these 5 applications. And so essentially with this combination of treatments, we wound up with 40 different treatment combinations for this trial. Really trying to find synergies between different product applications. If we have a higher population, is that going to be affected by fungicide more, for instance, or is the in-furrow fertilizer going to be influenced more with the nematicide? It's really a good comprehensive study for looking at many different decisions that a producer faces. So, some of the interesting observations that we got from this trial. One of the neat things that we found was with the in-furrow applications of MESZ and MAP. Now, these are roughly the same, except the MESZ has sulfur included in it. The interesting part was that each year we saw increased vigor early on in the season. And what this meant was we saw at least a 6-inch difference in height at the V4 leaf stage, and it also tended to have a little bit greener color. And this was more evident in 2012 than it was in 2013. But both years it was still there. However, at tassel, all plants were uniform height. And so we saw this height difference early, but they all tasseled out, and at harvest, if you looked across the top of the crop, there's no differences at all. There was one difference, though, not the final plant height, but if you actually went through and measured the ear heights, with the in-furrow applications, the cobs were roughly 3 to 4 inches lower than they were in the other plots. Take that for what it's worth. That may or may not matter for production decisions. It was just an interesting observation. But in any rate, there's no yield gain for those treatments. They made the corn look pretty, but didn't really matter as far as the yield. So some of the other results from this trial. Both times we looked at 2 different hybrid maturities, 2 different populations, No differences in any of the environments they were tested. Late season fungicide, we wound up with 1 site year of benefit to applying headline at the VT growth stage. With the seed treatment, we saw 1 year of statistical benefit to applying the nematicide. I'll get to that on the next slide with a little bit more detail. And with the other management factors that we looked at, there definitely were differences. Most consistently, that's where we saw the differences in yield, was in other management factors listed. Those other management factors were, again, early season fungicide, a application of a foliar micronutrient, Awaken, and then and then all those in combination with either the MAP or the MESZ. Now, again, I'd like to say that we found a nice clear-cut response, that something worked amazing and better than the rest, but in Carrington, we saw next to no response from these, although 2013, for some reason, we saw a little bit of a negative response with just the headline and Awaken, possibly because it was so hot and dry. We might have wound up burning the top a little bit when we made the foliar application. And Prosper is a little, actually somewhat similar, but a little bit different in the fact that they wound up with a little bit of a yield hit in 2012 with these applications. And in 2013, again, just like we did, we saw just a small yield drag after the application of the foliar micronutrient. That was really the only thing that was consistent, or as consistent as it could get, across all the environments for the number of factors that we were looking at. The other interesting thing happened was with a certain combination of products. I have listed up here, in 2012 in particular, we noticed that we had a positive response with headline applied at VT. We also had a positive response using Votivo seed treatment over just the traditional insecticide. However, when we looked at plots that received both those treatments, we actually wound up with something greater. You add these two together, you get 15%. However, we wound up with about 16% yield increase, indicating that there might be some kind of synergy involved with those two factors. And in fact, if we take that and look at the data a little bit more across all 4 locations, 2013 Carrington, if we don't look at that one, but 2012, this is that response I was showing you. If we look at the Prosper data, something really interesting happened there too. We didn't see a synergistic response, but we saw an exact additive response. So when we had headline versus no headline at the VT stage, we saw a 3.8% yield increase. When we used Votivo versus just Poncho, it was about 0.8. You add those two numbers together, and you get the exact response that we saw, adding both the Votivo and the headline to the plot. It was a 4.6% response. So that was very interesting. And in fact, the same exact thing happened in 2013. So it's a very additive response when looking at those two factors. If we can see this type of response with those two, that will very easily pay for itself very soon. Now, unfortunately, some of these responses are marginal again, and so the cost for these treatments might come down to the production costs of raising the corn and market price. But again, in 2013, for whatever reason, we saw a negative response with the Votivo. I'm not sure exactly what caused that this year. It was more so at the higher corn population than at the lower corn population, so there could be something there. But at any rate, the overall response was negative. So, conclusion to all this. Sometimes we found some fantastic yield responses from some of the special inputs that we included in these trials, but the environmental variability from year to year, location to location, really kind of clouds any type of profound conclusions that we can come up with And so the results will vary, I guess is the take-home message there. Questions? Yeah, so in all cases, for the trials that I was speaking with, it was repeated. There was 4 replications within each trial location, and each of those experiments was conducted at multiple locations. So it was fairly well replicated. Yep. So with the fungicides, the question was whether or not there were moisture differences, and with the fungicide treatments, the late season ones especially, there was sometimes up to a 1% increase in moisture. Most of the time it was nothing, but occasionally there was a little bit of an increase. Yeah, no, the map was applied based on the soil test results. And so it was, for instance, each year would have been a different application depending on the soil test on that site location. Each of the plots had the same amount of nitrogen. So yeah, the question is why there wasn't an in-furrow response in Prosper. Quite frankly, I can't speak to that. I haven't had a chance to visit with the PI in depth about that at this point. I just got these results are fairly fresh, and so I'll be curious about that as well. Yeah. So to answer your question, no, we did not use any satellite imagery, but we did take a visual measurement of vigor, so how well the plants looked compared to the neighboring plants. And the only thing that we noticed with the naked eye was that actually the in-furrow application headline tended to reduce vigor just after emergence. But as you saw the results at the end of the season, it made no difference. And in fact, within 3 weeks after emergence, you cannot tell a difference between what we saw earlier in this season and any other plant. So, anything else?
Did you do any plant growth regulators at all? Any research on that whatsoever?
Not in these trials. Are you going to talk about them?
No, but Awaken has.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, Awaken, yeah, it does have a plant growth regulator in it.
What stage is that on?
E5. We have done other studies here in Carrington with different application times of growth regulators. Greg had worked on that this year. And so in our annual reports, I think we'll find some Carrington data on that topic. We use just water as a carrier. This next year, we're going to look at applying in-furrow fungicides with 1034-0, for instance, although this year it was just water with the in-furrows. So.